Welcome back to the Aula. Welcome back to the St.Gallen Symposium and our discussion on shifting global powers. And this session is dedicated to one particular power that seems to not stop moving. 107 days of Donald Trump 2.0. I don't think I need to say more. You all have an idea in your head. We've heard his name this morning more than any other leader's name, even though the discussion that one of our panelists was part of was about the future of Europe. One also had a discussion implied there on the future of the United States of America. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about the State of the Union. My name is Claudia Brühwiler. I'm the designated peacekeeper as a Swiss national. I think I'm predestined to do that. Some neutrality is needed here, for we have people assembled that were in very different positions on November 5th last year when Donald J. Trump secured a second term as president. Jason Thielman, you have already met. It seems to be a constant winner. You've won today the debate, and you won big time last year, November 5th. Last year you were at this conference at our symposium talking about the conditions under which the Senate majority could be regained, could be secured for the Republican Party, since it was your job to deliver that, and you did. You made sure that there were 4 net seat gains for the Republican Party. You served as Chief of Staff for Senator Daines from your native Montana, and now you are delivering, as says the name of your new firm, strategy to results.
Thank you for that advertisement. Yeah.
Well, that's part of our job. Marcela Escobari, you were in a very different position than Jason. You were not among the victors. You served the government, the administration of Joe Biden in a very important role. You were White House National Security Council Special Assistant to the President and coordinator for the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection.
The longest title at the NRSC.
But it's a fantastic title, actually. And before that, you served USAID for Latin America and the Caribbean, a job that you already had held under the Obama administration. So you know what it means to be grilled not just once, but twice by the Senate. This is a walk in the park in comparison for you. And now you return to where you already gained your footing in public policy, namely with Brookings Institution, where you are now a senior fellow focusing on migration. And to the far right of me, and not totally representative of where you stand politically nor in life, is Ryan Enos. Some of you might have seen his name quoted in places like the New York Times, the New Yorker, might have seen him speak on CNN. He's done so during the presidential campaign, the run-up to the campaign, during the elections, time and again, not just last year. And this year, he has often been talking about the position his employer is in. For Ryan is a professor of government at Harvard University. He is a very special research agenda because he's really moving at the intersection of political psychology, political science, geography, and he's exploring, as goes the title of his first book, the space between us, or the space between US American citizens. And therefore, he has a very astute understanding of what is dividing Americans, because not everyone was united in your victory night, and to the victor goes the spoil of the first question. Jason, last year you were talking about the conditions under which the Republican Party could win, how you could secure these 4 net gains. You conquered Montana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia for the Republican Party Senate seats. What were now the factors that made you victorious? Was it really the economy, stupid? Was it migration? Or was it something that we did not have on the radar?
Well, as they say, success has many fathers. So I think when you evaluate an election success or an election defeat, there is a tendency to oversimplify oftentimes what went into that. There's a tendency for people like me to say, well, clearly the factor was, my brilliant efforts at managing a campaign effort and so forth, and I certainly think I was good at my job. But both of those factors had a great deal to do with it. But fundamentally, and we spoke about this last year, is there is a multiracial, multicultural realignment that is occurring in U.S. politics that is creating a very different dynamic as it relates to both the path to 270 electoral votes for winning the presidential election, as well as the path to Republicans maintaining a majority in the United States Senate. So Donald Trump first really accelerated what was a small move and change in voting behaviors in the United States in 2016, when you saw those in the bottom quartile of economic prosperity in the United States traditionally have been a rather Democrat audience. Trump narrowed that performance with that particular audience by the most of any Republican candidate in 3 to 5 decades in the United States in 2016, which is what especially powered his victory in key Midwestern states that are essential to the puzzle of winning the necessary electoral votes to be elected president in the United States. Those same underlying forces accelerated in 2020 from being what was primarily a white working class change to being much more of a multiracial working class change, with the president doing really outperforming any Republican candidate for president since Richard Nixon with the performance of African American voters, doing exceptionally well with Hispanic American voters, as well as the white working class voter. And where you have those same demographics also overlay where you had opportunities for Senate pickups.
But when you say underlying forces that have driven this realignment, what do you think are the key forces here? Is it mainly economic? Is it a class animus that is driving people?
It's economic, but there's a lot of factors that go into economic. But I think no doubt that was probably, if you were to stack rank, it probably ranks first. Although immigration certainly is a significant factor, but that also has interplay into economic, a sense of economic security, as you've seen, no doubt here in Europe as well. But it is more, even more fundamentally, if you were to look at voting behavior of Americans since FDR, and you ask them which party do you think best represents the working class? And up until basically 2024, Democrats enjoyed an advantage on that question. And Gallup has asked that question, I think, every presidential cycle for many decades, as well as throughout the years. And Republicans now enjoy an advantage on that question. Further, if you ask what do parties stand for, traditionally what people have perceived the Democratic Party to stand for is more of the working class. That has fundamentally changed. And it's really illustrated. I don't know if you do yard signs or political signs here in your European campaigns. I know you do a lot of poster boards. But the yard sign that is very common in urban, more Democrat neighborhoods around the country, and I'm going to get some of the wording wrong, but it goes along the lines of, in this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, we believe in diversity, we believe in science, we believe in inclusion, and so forth. Nothing in that value statement has anything to do with, we believe that there should be a chicken in every pot, that we believe that there should be high, living wages so people can have a prosperous economic future and be able to take care of their family. The Democratic Party has just really moved away from that being their primary value proposition, and that's left an opportunity for the Republican Party to really own what has traditionally been a Democrat advantage. That's really accelerated this realignment, and it is what the underlying factor on top of economic distress as a result of inflation that powered the strong victory for Republicans across the board in November.
The yard sign you just quoted, this is one that one sees very often in the part of America that Ryan lives in. In this house, we believe in science. In this house, we believe in, et cetera, et cetera. That's, by the way, not a sign you would see anywhere near here. We're not very good at those yard signs. Thankfully,
They don't matter, I would tell you.
But some say exactly these values that are stated on.
I'm not judging those values, by the way. I'm just making an observation.
But some are saying that this is an expression of certain left-wing excesses. So Ryan, as someone who really studies what is going on the ground, what is going on in the American political space, what is more to blame, if one wants to use that word, for the triumph of the Trump coalition last November? Is it more the excesses of the left or the misreading of what is actually moving the working class?
You know, something that I think Jason and I agree on very much here is these victories can always be overinterpreted, and they are so multi-causal, and people always want to pick their one cause and say that's it. And I'm not somebody that's going to defend the, those yard signs, even though you see them all over Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm also not somebody that thinks they are perhaps the biggest mover in American politics, because you don't see them in most places. You know, we tend to focus in on what people at places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Harvard University, or someplace like that are saying about American politics and believe that is what's causing things to change. But something I'd like to point out a lot about this election was there's a popular thing to do in the media and in academia and other places, which is predict election outcomes, for example. And this election outcome, using historical measures of prediction, was one of the most predictable elections we've seen in a long time. People knew within a percentage point or so what the popular vote was going to be. Some people had it going slightly one way or slightly another way. And Donald Trump won a narrow victory within that sort of prediction margin, meaning that the forces that have fueled American politics for 70 years largely seem to be at play in this election as well. And those were things like an economic downturn that largely took money out of people's pocketbooks through inflation. It had to do with perhaps a few other factors, like the incumbency status of the president. We can talk about other particular things, like the fact that Joe Biden probably should have dropped out of that election earlier. Democrats were shackled by some unpopular ideology that maybe they had expressed in 2020. But all of those things seem to not move the election outside of what was entirely predictable given historical trends in American politics. And when I think we think about it that way, what it means is when we talk about realignments, for example, we can often overstate those. Because if it was a realignment, it was still a realignment that fit into a very predictable pattern of American politics that we've seen over and over again for a long time. Now, what it ended up with is a president that is not part of a normal pattern of American politics. A president that has really moved things in an extraordinary direction, both internationally and domestically. He has, in my opinion, in the opinion of a lot of observers, turned something that moved the United States away from democracy and towards something that we would call a competitive authoritarian state. But all of that was a result of very predictable processes that did not seem to be any different than what we've seen unfold in American politics for a long time.
Let's get back to the question of what the state of the American regime is now a bit later, but I would like to go back to what you said, that there is a tendency to overstate the significance of what has happened in November, and that maybe the realignment wasn't as clear as it has been outlined by Jason. So would you still say that the working class is winnable for the Democratic Party?
So I think where I would agree with Jason is rhetorically Democrats have moved away from thinking about what people might call these kitchen table issues. They're not trying to they have not emphasized trying to put a chicken in every pot, and perhaps have been distracted by things like Black Lives Matter signs and things like that. But it's hard to separate the appeal of Donald Trump from what we might think of as a long-term realignment. And I'm not willing to declare something a long-term realignment after 2 election cycles. The Republican Party despite Donald Trump's appeal to the white working class, and that's an important distinction to make, is that often when we talk about the working class, we're narrowing in on the white working class, because this racial realignment can also be overstated. When we talk about Donald Trump making great gains with African American voters, we're still looking at upwards of 80% of African American voters voting for Joe Biden. So those gains are pretty marginal, ultimately. And we're talking about the white working class. But that white working class shift is something that seems to have happened perhaps only because of Donald Trump. And even though it's happened, the Republican Party has not delivered policy successes for the working class of any race in the United States. They've ushered in tax cuts for the wealthy. They haven't expanded anything that the working class may demand for other reasons, union protections, whatever you want to think about, that would be a policy victory for the working class has not occurred. And in many ways, what we might see then is that the Republican Party, in the same way the Democratic Party is perhaps trying to deliver symbolic victories and talking about Black Lives Matter and things like that, that the Republican Party is simply trying to, and Donald Trump in particular, is trying to deliver symbolic victories in the form of harsh rhetoric about immigration, or talking about class warfare issues against Wall Street and Hollywood and other such things that really don't make a material difference for the working class. And it's not clear how long that is sustainable as a winning coalition.
You've already mentioned the harsh rhetoric of the Trump administration, and then a year before, the harsh rhetoric of the Trump campaign on migration, and actually of the entire Republican Party that was blaming the Biden administration of actually not facing up to what they claimed was a crisis at the border, a migration crisis. Marcela, you were in the midst of the eye of the storm, so to say. When you were following these competing narratives on what was going on in terms of the situation at the border, in terms of the flows of migrants to the country, were you looking at the same thing as were Republican pundits, Republican politicians that were criticizing the Biden administration?
Thank you. Well, first of all, if there's something that the first 100 years of Trump can give us is assurances that the St.Gallen students...
He's only serving 2 terms, not 100 years.
Oh, yeah. I forgot that it feels like that.
It sometimes feels like that.
It feels like 100 years sometimes.
Yeah. No, but that the St.Gallen students really always nail the topic of these conferences. So I didn't know that they could have predicted our election results back then. Yeah, migration, I think, had an oversized effect in the election. At the end of the day, Americans are quite centrist when it comes to migration. They don't like illegal migration. They want order at the border. They value legal migration. Even 2023, 70% of Americans believe in the value of migration and to the country. And Biden and Obama before him were actually quite restrictive on irregular migration. I think in the end, the Biden administration was confronted with unprecedented numbers at the border, many cities feeling overwhelmed by these inflows, and an effective political campaign that linked those inflows to violent crimes. There was a lot of misinformation in that campain too, but weaponizing migration, it tends to pay off in election cycles. The Biden administration was able to reduce those numbers at the border dramatically at the end of the administration. But at that point, it couldn't break through the noise. And I think it's part of a discussion of that polarized environment that we're in. And I do think it's important that Trump won with his 1.5% of the popular vote. But I think it would be a mistake to see that as a mandate for the kind of migration policy that we're seeing right now.
You mentioned that the Biden administration was confronted with a perfect storm when it came to migration. So what were the reasons for that in the first place?
So we didn't talk about this enough, but we in the US were confronting, we talked about the policy response, but we were confronting the largest displacement of people in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And this was caused by many things. Mostly 8 million people who have left one country, Venezuela, in a very compressed period of time that actually started in the first Trump administration because of the economic collapse and mismanagement of the Maduro regime. Most of that went to Latin America. And then we had the double whammy of COVID. Latin America actually got hit the hardest. It had the largest contraction in the world post-COVID, over 7% of GDP. And the US had the fastest recovery. So we had a big pent-up labor demand, which the health of our economy has been strongly correlated with the numbers of the border for the last 25 years across administrations. So it was the perfect storm. It was larger than Syria and Ukraine.
But would you say there is truth to the argument that Republicans made that Joe Biden did too little too late, that the administration reacted too late and with only the upcoming election in mind to the situation?
So I think that argument's a bit misleading, and that what the administration did is what actually has worked in the last 100 years of managing migration, because this is not the first time. I mean, the magnitude was huge, but it's not the first time that we have pressures in our land and sea borders. And usually what works is this combination of increased enforcement with the creation of limited expansion of lawful pathways. This time around, there was a third aspect that I think was new and crucial to managing this, which was working with 22 countries in the hemisphere for them to increase enforcement throughout the migratory path and also to absorb migrants. So when Colombia is able to legalize migrants and migrants can put their kids to school and enter the labor force, they tend not to move upwards. And by the end of that, of 2024, migrant encounters at the border had gone down more than 75%. And Latin America had absorbed over 4.5 million migrants. And that didn't happen overnight. The enforcement action started from the beginning of the administration. But there's something that a lot of people don't know about our system, which is when we say our migration system is broken, we talk about the asylum system, which really has become a loophole in the American system. 90% of asylum seekers are denied their claims. But because we have a backlogged system and limited detention capacity, people are let in and come back 5 to 6 years later. So successive administrations had tried to deal with that issue. So in 2021, Biden changed certain rules so that asylum officers could actually adjudicate claims, not just immigration judges. After Title 42 ended, it had the circumvention of lawful pathways. You could not claim asylum here unless you did it with the CBP-1 app, which meant that we could meter the flow of people and know who was coming into the country, or you had to claim asylum elsewhere. So by the time, and then we worked with the region to increase enforcement in a variety of ways, particularly with Mexico, who did internal enforcement. So by the time that we did that final rule in mid-2024, it worked because everything else was working, and we had really, I think the administration sought to change the incentive structure, the risk, and the incentive structure of the migrant, wherever it was, to say, if I go to the US and go through that terrible journey where I'll get exploited, extorted, and probably raped through the Darien, if I make it, my chances of succeeding are really low. But I have these alternative pathways that if I wait, I can come here legally. And eventually that worked, and worked in a way that was able to hold. So I don't think you would have had those numbers if those actions wouldn't have happened through time. Now, we tried immigration reform, we tried a border bill, all of those failed in Congress. So there are ways and there are learnings, no question, of how this could have been faster or easier or earlier.
Jason, the migration bill was blocked by the Republicans because Trump told them so in order to have better chances at winning the election. Listening to what Marcela is describing, one thinks, well, this doesn't sound fixable. Is your party just playing dirty
Well, it was blocked because it was an insufficient response to the challenge facing our country. And what you hear is a complete abdication of responsibility.
But it was a
failure.
bipartisan effort in the beginning.
It did have Republicans that were working on a bipartisan effort, but ultimately it was rejected because not a sufficient number of Republicans in the U.S. Senate felt it was an adequate solution to the historic problem that was created by the Biden administration.
Was it really? I mean, we hear that there were mainly external
On the very
factors.
first day of the Biden administration, they began rolling back Trump-era policies, and you saw a spike in migration. Additionally, their rhetoric immediately invited people from around the world, especially in South America, that basically we're going to have open borders. And they responded in kind, and unfortunately raped, taken advantage of in the process through great human misery, through irresponsible rhetoric of the Biden administration. Now, I, for one, couldn't be more thrilled that I see a complete delusional response from my two colleagues to the left with regards to the responsibility
Ryan
that their
hasn't
policies,
said anything.
I haven't said a word
that their policies are responsible for, both in losing the election with regards to not recognizing alignment. It's not just a white working class alignment. As I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump received more votes from African American than any Republican candidate for president since Richard Nixon. This is, the percentage may be small, but the change is historic and monumental as it relates to the future potential for success for the Democrat Party to be a majority party both in the Senate and reclaiming presidential elections. But much of what you're hearing here, now to go back to immigration as migration, is this reinvention of history that the Biden administration was attempting to solve this through 4 years. They didn't attempt to solve it until Democrat members of Congress, primarily for election in the Senate, were freaking out about their election prospects and and being able to hold the Senate and being able to win back the Congress. And demanded that there must be some sort of action taken, and it was taken too late. All things that could have been done and addressed much earlier, they chose not to, and largely because they recognize that they are losing the American people. So they're fundamentally trying to change and reinvent the electorate in hopes of being able to create a new electoral majority to stay into power. And that's all this has been about for them: is using immigration as a means to seize power in America.
Ryan, you wanted to add something.
I did want to add something. I would respond to Jason's last comment that I think that this claim that Democrats are trying to use immigration to gain electoral advantage comes close.
We're literally trying to change laws in the United States and cities to allow illegal immigrants to vote.
Let him finish the sentence first.
I think that's a very dangerous statement, and I think we should avoid that. The United States has a proud history of immigration. It's something, there was a lot of discussion in the panel you were on earlier, Jason, about what separates the United States from Europe. And I think without a doubt, our history of immigration is something that has been a strength for the United States and has made it into the country it is today. And when we start casting in electoral terms, we're going down a very dangerous path. And there's no evidence other than rhetoric that that is actually what Democrats are trying to do. Once upon a time, Republicans...
You're trying to change the laws to allow illegal immigrants to vote and change the outcome of elections.
Nobody's actually trying to do that, though.
Yes, they are. New York City, there's multiple cities and municipalities. There are literally municipalities that have changed the law.
They're letting residents vote in local elections, not federal elections. They're letting people that have lived there.
But are not legal citizens.
For not legal citizens
So
to vote.
it's not
That's
mythology
actually
or not
something
factual on my
you have
part.
in Europe too, that EU citizens
Sure,
can
a person,
sometimes
we could have
vote in other countries.
We could have a very reasonable discussion about whether somebody has lived in an area for a long time should be allowed to vote in a local election. People could disagree on that.
So you think illegal immigrants who have been in the area for some time should be able to vote?
I think one could have that discussion. I actually don't have an opinion about it, but I would not say that that is a matter of Democrats trying to bring people in to change elections. There's no evidence for that. But that actually, one thing I wanted to mention here, that was just an aside. Part of the theme of this panel is how permanent this change is. And these electoral gains that Jason has been talking about, for example, among racial minorities, those have all, if you look at polling, and this is not one poll, we're talking about poll after poll after poll, the signal is very clear here, those have been wiped out. All the gains that Trump had with minority voters are now gone and are going back in the other direction. And of course, we see this with Americans generally. We see this when it comes to Trump policies on immigration. We see this in almost every policy he has. And so
Trump policies on immigration remain very popular in America. What poll are you referencing?
They lost 4 to 7 points on migration in the last 100 days, and most of the people that are being lost are the Latino voters that it gained.
Are they do they remain net popular?
No, they're not. They don't remain net popular.
What poll does not show Trump's immigration policies are not net popular?
So the polling average for Trump's immigration policies will put it right around 50%. Now keep in mind, this was his most popular issue going into the election. He has lost more ground on that than almost any other issue and is barely above water. If things keep going the direction they will, which public opinion tends to go, he will be in the negative probably by the end of the week. It's hard to look at those and claim that the American public favors these immigration policies.
And there's ways to handle immigration, and that's the difference is what policies you want to put in place versus what problems you want to solve. And I think we have to move away from campaigning to governing. I think Biden ran at some point on a more humane approach to migration, and that was in response to Muslim ban, family separation, to very anti-migrant policies that actually most Americans were against. We want to solve migration. We want to turn it into legal migration. People understand there are ways to do it, and I think there's a lot that we could learn and that we learned from this massive displacement of people. But we are going back to a set of policies that don't make us stronger. I mean, closing almost all legal migration, having these dehumanizing photo ops, the threats to due process and rule of law. I mean, I think these are the ways in which this administration is going about it, I think are going to become, and have already become, not popular with the American people. Solving the problem, absolutely. I think we're on the same page.
I think time will tell in November if we see Democrats campaigning on a return to Biden-era immigration policies, and I don't think you're going to see that.
I mean, migration reform is one of the areas that Americans are having very heated debates on, and we haven't seen a migration reform in like 30 years. You mentioned the backlog. We have 3 million court cases that are pending. So all that actually screams for capacity building. And at the same time, we see a state that is being rebuilt in the different direction. What kind of America first and America primacy agenda have Americans really signed up for here if capacity building is not in the books, Jason?
Could you reframe your question? I'm not sure if I'm following.
If you're destroying the administrative state, as is currently happening under DOGE, under the Department of Government Efficiency, as it is termed, how strong can America really be to...
I could not more strongly reject the premise of your question. We're destroying the administrative state.
It looks like it.
What we are doing is we are trying to make government more efficient and effective for the people and make sure government and the administrative state doesn't serve itself and actually serves the people. As Winston Churchill once said, public servants, no longer servants, no longer for the public, no longer serving the public, and that is in many instances what has happened with the administrative state. It has taken on a power of itself that is not responsive to the democratic form of government, not responsive to the will of the people. They're the highest paid people in the country with the highest level of benefits. And a tremendous amount of waste and inefficiency that is not delivering better service. So the idea of having the Department of Government Efficiency is to actually go in and aggressively confront the administrative state and make certain that you turn it to what it should be, which is a civil service. Actually, it was not public servant, civil servant, no longer civil, no longer servants, was what Winston Churchill said. And that's the challenge, I think, with much of the bureaucracy in the American government, is it was no longer civil and it was no longer servants to the American people or making the economy stronger. And frankly, nor can we afford it.
But let's bring a little nuance to that, because I think everybody would agree, and here and in the US, that we have to. And I think what we've seen in the last 100 days even creates more urgency that we need a more accountable state, that we need a reform of the civil service, that we just need a government that works for the people and does it more aggressively and more accountable. The way that it has happened, and I'll give you the example of foreign aid, has been reckless. I mean, and we are losing capability to respond to crises. I mean, we had Catholic churches, Catholic charities. They have a $1.4 billion organization, mostly through the generosity of people around the world, also receives USAID funding. They responded to 80% of our response in South Sudan. They were providing the only meal that some kids got that day, right? When the freezing of aid happened, they used all of their own income, and at some point, they couldn't pay the contractors. That food rotted. There will be thousands of deaths attributed to the way that this was done. We monitor diseases in 50 countries for pandemics of, Ebola, Mansburg virus, Mpox. That capability has been completely paralyzed. Our ability to respond to crises around the world. I can give you example after example that if you want to cut, you want to make it more efficient, you'll have all of America behind you. The way it has been done, it has not only destroyed our soft power, but it is destroying government capability, lawyers, diplomats. The best people are the ones that are leaving government. You can do it. The way it's happening, I think, is short-sighted at least.
I think
Ryan,
it's really...
Ryan, as how permanent do you see these changes that are happening to the administrative state? I'll give you the word afterwards.
Of course, it's hard to know. It's a lot easier to tear something down than it is to build it up. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of this tearing down has been reckless and might be hard to rebuild. But one of the things...
That's the goal.
Yeah, I know that. And one of the things, though, that's important to keep in mind about this is these programs were put in place by Congress. Jason spoke about the democratic will, and at least in the United States, as set forth in the United States Constitution, the democratic will means that they elect members of Congress that pass laws that set up the administrative agencies that then remain in perpetuity until the law says they go away. Now, Donald Trump, as he does in many cases, has chosen to ignore the United States Constitution and tear these down. You might imagine in a system, a democratic system, that Congress will find the will to restart these things under a democratic president or under somebody else. But what I fear will happen is that because many very good programs, such as the ones that Marcela mentioned, there's many others. We could talk about things like the National Institute of Health, the NSF, things that touch me as an academic, that have achieved American greatness in science and other places that have been attacked by the Trump administration, may not come back in their previous capacity because Donald Trump has declared, or somebody, Elon Musk or whoever seems to be pulling the strings there, has declared that these are not something that creates an advantage for the United States and that Republicans in Congress will follow him down that dangerous path.
You just mentioned that a lot of these changes could actually have been effected through Congress, and the president has a majority in Congress. Why is he sidestepping both chambers, and why are your senators, why are Republican congressmen actually fine with being sidelined, even though the president is assuming powers that would belong to Congress?
He's not assuming powers inappropriately. He's not taking unconstitutional action. We have a process in the United States for determining that, and the courts will determine whether executive power is being used in an inappropriate fashion. And thus far, his actions, as it relates to DOJ, have not been rejected by the Supreme Court. So, should and if they will, then obviously those actions will have to be unwound. But really what you're substituting here in place of fact is what your preference and what you wish to see happen, and using arguments that just aren't substantiated by the reality of the situation, by simply waving around it's unconstitutional, it's unlawful, it's authoritarian. I mean, the only authoritarian actions that I see from democratic governments are what I see in Europe with banning people from the ballot and spying on political parties in opposition. Now that seems authoritarian and undemocratic to me. Now a president exercising his lawful authority until Congress can choose to rein in that authority or change that authority. They certainly have that prerogative and right to do so in a process to do so, but they have not chosen to do so, largely because the majority in Congress support the president's aggressive actions. And when you talk about a more methodical way of going about trimming government and addressing these services, what you really mean is you want to take enough time so we can actually get it done, because you want to keep the administrative state in place because you benefit from it, even though it does not actually benefit the American people.
So you would say that, of course, Republicans would act up in Congress if they considered
and in some instances,
was...
right? In some instances, they have disagreed. They have, and certain actions and changes have occurred as a result. And if they overall think the authorities that are being exercised by the president, they could have the power to completely rein those in. And they haven't. There's been no action in Congress, other than some Democrats who've introduced legislation, to take any meaningful action to do that. But there is a democratic process for this, both within the courts, both within Congress. And this irresponsible rhetoric of unconstitutional is just ridiculous, right?
So,
there is a constitutional power to reign. There is a constitutional means of reigning in his power. And that hasn't been, that hasn't occurred because his power is thus far constitutional.
So you also remain optimistic, or you don't doubt that the president will also respect their judiciary?
Yes, but like every president, right, they're always going to be as aggressive about pushing executive power.
Ryan, Jason has pushed back on the notion that the president should be described as authoritarian. You've already used the term in this discussion. Why do you stick by the definition of authoritarian when you're speaking about Trump?
I would absolutely stick by that. And, I say this as a scholar of politics. I do not say this as a partisan. I'm happy to discuss my own political beliefs and how those fit into Donald Trump's policies, but that's not what I'm speaking about here. And it also has nothing to do with what goes on in Europe. We can talk about the merits of what may be going on with European politics, but that does not change the matters on the ground in the United States. So Donald Trump is somebody who has had his administration arrest people for their political speech and put them away in prison without trial. He's somebody that has shipped American citizens overseas to foreign prisons. He is somebody who has tried to silence the speech of media organizations by suing them and using the powers of the state to get them to not disagree with him. He is somebody that has attacked universities because they disagree with him. He is somebody that has attacked lawyers and judges because they disagree with him. And you look at any authoritarian throughout history, especially in the 20th century, in places like Turkey, in places like Russia, in places like Hungary, in places like Venezuela, places that the United States used to condemn and should condemn, and they took those exact same actions. You can pick up the textbook definition of competitive authoritarianism, and it takes exactly the actions that Donald Trump is taking now. There is no doubt that he is operating as a competitive authoritarian. This goes beyond politics. It is not a question of disagreeing with his policies. And when it comes down to it, a lot of people, there are policies, in fact, that Donald Trump has that I would agree with at times, but that would not change the fact that he is operating as authoritarian in a way that is dangerous to American democracy and is a radical break with the democratic tradition in the United States, and is something that Americans, and frankly, people across the world should condemn.
Jason, I think you might want to disagree.
Yes, no, the Biden administration and the Obama administration certainly didn't weaponize the IRS to silence Republican and conservative groups. I think if you want to take a look at actions that are authoritarian, I think you need to look at both the Obama and the Biden administration and the various ways that they weaponize government to silence critics, silence citizens, to silence President Trump, to try to attempt to put him in jail. The absurdity of what you are trying to put forward as there's this unique break of Donald Trump, of his actions, there are processes within our system that are completely robust and resilient for any of his actions to be held accountable within our process. What we actually have seen in the prior years under the Biden administration, now that was an unprecedented break, where you literally tried to jail your political opponents and silence them. That was an unprecedented break. So how you can possibly, muster with any sort of candor or intellectual honesty the argument just made is just baffling.
Right.
Donald Trump violated the cardinal rule of democracy. He did not accept an election loss that was legitimate. Once a politician does that...
I'm sorry, didn't he leave power? He didn't agree with the outcome of the election, didn't think the election was fair, but he wasn't forcibly removed from the White House. He left peacefully.
There was something like January 6th,
yeah,
I recall.
He sued. Look, I will stand by the statement that Donald Trump did not accept that loss, and I don't think that's worth arguing over. That is the cardinal rule of democracy, and that's why Donald Trump was investigated by the United States government for breaking the laws of trying to overturn these elections. He was investigated by a system of prosecution that has existed and applies to everybody equally in a democratic country. But one thing I want to point out, and this is, I think, the key here, Jason, is that you said that we have systems in place that adjudicate the constitutionality of these actions. Every country I mentioned earlier that slipped into authoritarianism was also a democracy. Hungary was a democracy, Venezuela was a democracy, Turkey was a democracy for 90 years. And they became authoritarian states. There's nothing magic about democracies that means that an authoritarian state cannot grow out of that democracy if the politicians, and especially the executive, violate the norms and rules of that democratic system. And the minute Donald Trump broke with 200 years of American tradition and said he is going to muster lies, and to be very clear, those were lies, there was no other way to put it, to say that he won an election, that he lost,
that's not
then
true.
he broke those norms.
The Electoral Count Act of 1868, which is the legal process in which Trump used to object to the outcome of the election, was put in place in 1868 as a result of a contested election. There's nothing unprecedented. There was a process in place
If we have to go back to 1868 to say that that is the other example of a break in American democracy,
no, it wasn't a break in American democracy.
I would say that the United States had a pretty good run
My point is there wasn't a break in
Trump.
American democracy. That's my point. My point is that you have had contested elections where people have disagreed with the outcome.
Did they send a violent mob to attack the Capitol?
Did not send a violent mob to attack the Capitol.
The courts were
It looked pretty violent at the time.
I was in the Capitol. It was violent, but he
Yes.
did not send a violent mob to the Capitol. That is just simply not an accurate statement, but a popular perception, and something that just you guys love to propagate as part of here, as to suggest there is some sort of a legal effort to seize power and that the president did not leave office and accept the outcome of the election, even if he didn't agree with it.
Gentlemen, there's a lady caught in the middle of this. Marcela, you've been listening to this, and you are someone who now with Brookings Institution also tries to think of how to move forward with migration policy. How can the United States move forward when already very intelligent, very, very high-profile people are bickering about very profound facts
We're not bickering,
already?
we're passionately disagreeing.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a very
Yeah.
feminine way of putting it. Men are passionately disagreeing, women are bickering, so, But Marcela, when you're listening to that and when you're thinking about the political climate, how can you work with that for such a touchy, polarizing issue as migration is?
Look, on migration, I think it'll become evident that these policies, as the ones that we had in the first Trump administration, are going to be short-lived in solving the problem. The last times that we've had changes in migration policy, comprehensive migration policy, have actually happened in Republican administrations. There might be a moment where people realize that this is not working for America. It's going to hurt us economically. It's going to abuse our due process and our rule of law. It is inhumane and not aligned with our values, and again, the list can continue, and hopefully there won't be the kind of boycotts on actual reform on political grounds, and perhaps in 2 years there will be an opening. I'm going to work towards that, and if not in 4 years. But I think it is an issue that has become a distraction in politics because it's so easy to weaponize when it is manageable. It is manageable. We know how to do it. We learned a lot during these last 4 years. We learned a lot in other spikes under other governments. I think you were challenging us to think about positive ways to end our intervention, which is tough in the world that we're living on. I think that there is a wake-up call in the U.S. that we should have been, and this is all of our administrations, more responsive to the needs of citizens. The problems are severe. We have a dwindling middle class. We have a divergence, a bifurcation of our labor force. People are, the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. Americans have increased their precariousness. They're working 3 jobs and can't make ends meet. That's a real, AI is going to accelerate that. Those are real issues that are not being addressed right now, and it is leading to the easy answer to complex problems. And I think this is my last ask of Europe. There's no question, and it was discussed earlier today, that you need to reform fast. Sometimes the moments of urgency have made you rise to the occasion. You definitely need to, create a more entrepreneurial ecosystem. We're definitely going to be helping you, given that investment is moving your way. But there is something that is an European strength. And there's, I think, a false trade-off between regulation and innovation. You have a regulatory prowess. And these moves on GDPR, on privacy, on content moderation, I think those are going to continue to be a source of strength, even though you're going to continue to iterate and make it better and less costly for smaller companies and whatnot. But they're also helpful for the rest of us in preserving our democracy. Because part of the polarization that we have is because, we are not able to talk to each other, and we are entering a surveillance stage. So these regulations that you have created and then that the world copies by force are going to be more important in the future, so that we can preserve not just democracy, but liberal democracy.
Thank you so much, Marcela. You said that there is a wake-up call for America. This is your wake-up call, because you are now allowed to ask questions. I think we need some light and we need some mics. Hands up if you have a question to our panelists. And when you do and you're called upon, please stand up, tell us your name, and remember, questions end with a question mark. And shouldn't be too long. Keep it short and simple. Kiss your question, please.
I'm Sudhir Jalan from India. We have heard a very learned debate on Republicans versus Democrats on migration. Can I ask the panelists to get their views on the tariffs?
Ooh. Now is your time to win the popularity contest.
I think I only had one of those today. It's been downhill since, right? But, this is what I think. I think when you all gather here again a year from now, perhaps two, but I think within a year from now, you are going to see a world that has lower tariffs and fewer trade protections. I do recognize how jarring the aggressive actions of the administration can feel as it relates to trying to take on the administrative state and try to reform it, much the same way as it might feel with tariffs. But I think the reality is sort of genteel negotiations to reduce trade barriers, including with India for a lot of agricultural products, right? I'm from the state of Montana. We've been negotiating with India for 20 years on trying to reduce trade barriers on pulse crops, which are, pretty aggressively slanted against the American farmer. Absent aggressive action, I don't think we can really be successful in getting other countries to remove their protectionist policies and create ultimately freer and fairer trade. Now, there are certainly two ways this can go. We can end up where we have a world with everyone having higher trade barriers and more protectionism. But I think ultimately what we're going to see here is that you're going to see countries remove their protectionist policies in exchange for seeing the tariffs pulled back. And the more likely outcome here, a year from today, is that we actually have freer and fairer trade around the globe. Now, China will probably be the exception to that, but I think most people here would agree that if anybody has exploitive trade practices, it is China.
Ryan.
Since Jason and I were described as bickering earlier, I want to say I think we're going to agree on this point a little bit. I don't know if it'll be in a year, but I think that we will see these tariffs go away, and we'll see a different economic landscape from it. But I would say it for a slightly different reason, I think, which is One is Trump's stated goal of bringing back manufacturing in the United States is not going to happen. It's not going to happen both because of macroeconomic forces, where it's just not going to exist in a country as wealthy as the United States, but it's also not going to exist because of the uncertainty of another administration coming in 3 years and changing policy, and that's just not time to create the sort of infrastructure that's needed for manufacturing. I think it also might not exist because this is not a popular policy, like a lot of the things that Donald Trump does. And what I think that points to is that we've seen an instance here, and you see Congress reacting to this a little bit bipartisanly, is that this is an example where the President of the United States simply has too much power in the way that law is currently wielded, where he can use emergency powers to declare tariffs. And it's one person having the power to disrupt the world economic system that greatly is remarkable. And it was not the way those systems were imagined, and it's not the way the United States system of tariffs was designed either. And I think it's possible that we will see that power pulled back from the president. I think this is one of these instances where Congress actually will, in a very rare instance, regain some of its authority because there's simply not a large appetite for allowing the president to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to add? Or?
Just to add that I hope that Jason's right, that we end up with lower tariffs, and eventually we might get there as things always get pulled back. But I think some of the damage is already done in the policy uncertainty, which I fear means investment leaving the U.S.
So, traveling Mike, there's a gentleman in, I don't know what row, 5th row maybe? It's best to stand up. Thank you. Let us know who you are.
Hello, my name is Mark Howard. I am a PhD student in constitutional law from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you everyone for your brilliant perspectives on this important topic. My question is open to anyone on the panel who would like to answer it. On the 15th of February 2025, Donald Trump quoted Napoleon Bonaparte on social media stating, "He who saves his country violates no law." I'd like to hear the panelists' perspectives on this quote in reference to the rule of law in America and the future of the judiciary in upholding constitutional law. Thank you.
This sounds like you, Ryan.
It's clearly a statement that is completely out of touch with the tradition of American constitutional and democratic governance. It can't be defended from the perspective of the rule of law. And I think relates to other things that Donald Trump has done, fortunately largely on social media. And it's important to state that these are more rhetorical at this point than actual, where he's tweeted "Long live the king" and put himself in a crown. And you think about how shocking that is to the American tradition. He recently dressed himself up as the Pope. Sort of, who knows what that means? But that kind of rhetoric is concerning, to put it mildly. And I think what we worry about, and I don't want to overstate this, because again, going back, I think where Jason and I have some common ground, is that the courts have held their constitutional position of checking that kind of power so far. But there are people in the Trump administration who are agitating, is the word I would use, publicly, to try to shake the power of the courts, to try to limit their power, to say that district courts, for example, cannot overrule the executive, that they can't check the President of the United States, which would be completely out of the American tradition of what the courts can do. That kind of rhetoric is what we've seen in other countries that slipped into competitive authoritarianism, where they've denied the legitimacy of the courts, first rhetorically, and eventually use that as a way to bypass that authority altogether or to bring the courts under their control. And I worry that we are headed that direction in the United States. And when Trump makes statements like this, he is essentially using a testing ground to see whether the public will react to such statements and try to reject them. As I mentioned, fortunately, there's a lot of evidence that the American public does. And ultimately, I think that will be the ultimate check on what seems to be, and I don't want to psychoanalyze Donald Trump, it's not my job, it's not my expertise, but what seems to be Donald Trump's sort of impulse to have an expansive view of executive power that is more in line with the king and not a president of the United States.
Jason, when we talk about such posts, is this just Trump being Trump, or do they make you concerned?
It is Trump. It is certainly Trump. Trump being Trump. This is what raises my ire. is, and perhaps, you commented on this, but just a short time ago, the Democrats tried to seize power over the United States Supreme Court by unilaterally changing the law to pack the Supreme Court in what would be considered most likely, and hopefully the court would have ruled and prevented this, a violation of the US Constitution. So there's so much indignation over the Republicans trying to expand the use and the power of the executive to get the political outcomes they want, which is absolutely true. Of course they are. However, this is not unique. The Democrats have put forward and aggressively pursued and even passed legislation out of the House, out of the US Congress when they had control, to basically seize power over the courts so they could get any law they wanted to be deemed constitutional. An outrageous effort at a power grab. Now, my point here is that what is great about America and what is great about our institutions, what is fantastic and amazing about our Constitution, is the resiliency of our system to check what are the always going to be the behaviors and approach of any party in power at one time, which is going to do what it can to enact the laws and the policies that they believe the people who voted for them and that they think are best for their country. And both parties equally tried to push the envelope on every opportunity. But what is fantastic about our system and our resiliency is it always keeps a check and balance on that. Our founders recognized this impulse. And what is just very frustrating for me is somehow or another that this impulse is unilateral to Republicans. What is really being said is we actually don't have a problem with someone trying to push the bounds of executive authority or push the respectability and the importance and the impartiality of the courts. We just don't like it when you want to do something we don't like.
I think there is an impulse in the room to go on this trajectory, but I don't want to deprive you of the chance to have a few additional questions from the audience. There's a gentleman to the right. Oh, no, let's go for, sorry, I'm gender discriminating. Let's first go with the lady here on the left. You're up next. Oh, I'm sorry, you're shaking your head. You'll be next, sorry.
I'll keep mine quick.
Yeah.
My name is Sian Tabor. I'm just an English teacher. I'm nothing fancy. My question is really that, okay, Trump being Trump, what kind of statement is that, first of all? Second of all, the biggest question I wanted to ask was these executive orders. We have Canada, we have the Panama Canal, we have Greenland, and Donald Trump wanting to take over the world, but not really getting involved in other things. So where is the line? What does he want to get involved in, and what doesn't he want to get involved in?
He wants to get involved in those things that he thinks advances the interest of our country, of my country, and the country that he's responsible for governing. That's not his responsibility.
So could you move the mic to the gentleman here on the right? Yeah, he raises his hand again.
Can I respond?
And then Ryan can also respond, and then we move to your question immediately. Yeah.
First of all, don't say you're just an English teacher. That's a fantastic and important job, and I admire you for doing it. I think, we could disagree about whether it advances the interest.
And probably will.
Well, about whether it advances the interest of the United States. But I think your question raised an important point, which is these executive orders do not just impact the United States. Or these aren't even executive orders; these are just Trump talking. But most of them anyway. But what for better or worse, the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world. And when they say things, it does not just come across as rhetoric. It's like the United States is the most powerful country in the world. It's like if a bully comes up to you in the schoolyard that's twice your size and says, I am going to take your lunch money, and then says, oh, sorry, I was just kidding. It doesn't make it any less scary. It doesn't change your behavior on that schoolyard in the future that you might want to avoid that bully. And when Trump makes these statements, it disrupts, because of the position of the United States, it disrupts the globe. It causes countries to distrust the United States when somebody acts as an aggressor like that. And it has consequences that go beyond just talking. And that's why I'm glad you asked the question. It shows the importance of what Trump says. It's not just Trump being Trump. It's Trump affecting the entire world.
Mm-hmm. And there is an additional factor that's at play. I don't know if it's unique, but it's definitely aggravated, which is the environment of fear that has been created. When Trump put that plane in the air against the judgment of the courts with over 200 migrants and put them in a Salvadorian gulag, 90% of which do not have a criminal record, it went against the court's order. You can discuss the technicalities, but judges who have ruled against Trump now, because of the power of the internet and Elon Musk's power over X, their families end up getting targeted. This is not something that is specific to Donald Trump, but it definitely has created this chilling effect of self-censorship that I think is dangerous, and it is being weaponized and not. And I don't think this administration is doing enough to control it. To the opposite, I think it often adds wood to the fire.
We move to your question. You gracefully accepted ladies first, but now it's your turn.
Thank you very much. Everyone talks about Trump as though he's the cause as opposed to a symptom, and I just sort of referring to this Pew research where the trust, and you were talking about trust in American government among citizens is an all-time low, 14%, which I think used car salesmen even have higher levels of trust. And do you think there's a minimum threshold of trust that the American system needs to be legitimate? And if so, what could be achieved? What could be done to achieve that?
Wonderful question.
Yeah,
What minimum
I love
level
your
of
question
trust?
too. I wish I had a good answer for you, but I think you're right that Trump is a more neutral way to describe Trump is Trump is a populist, and populists come to power when there is a demand for some kind of change, when people feel like something is broken, and I think that there's a long recognition, other people have said this, even at this symposium, that something in the United States was demanding change. And the Democratic Party, to be very transparent about my own views on this, was not delivering that. More globally, I think a lot of center-left parties across the globe have not been delivering that, and that's part of what's opened up spaces for figures like Donald Trump, because he's not the only person across the world that sort of takes on these characteristics. But the more important question is the one you asked about what could change to make that, to have these kind of things go away. And I think one of an enduring characteristic of American democracy, but something that perhaps has become more acute in the last 40 years, is this great rise in inequality and the demise of upward mobility, or a perception of upward mobility among the working class. And there used to be a belief, going back to what I said about the Democrats, that Democrats could deliver on policies that would help alleviate that inequality and deliver upward mobility. And when that has gone away, I think there's a general pullback from a belief that the American system is something that is going to deliver the kind of quality of life and the kind of thing that always Americans came to expect as sort of part of the virtue of being an American. And in many ways, I think Donald Trump has seized that sort of discontent and ridden that to power, not popularity, but power, in a way that has led to all these consequences we're speaking about now.
Last question goes to the gentleman in the back there.
Hi, my name is David Ong. I'm from Singapore. I do not pro-China nor US. Okay.
Neutral, like Switzerland.
If I lived in your neighborhood, I'd do the same thing.
Okay. I used to be I'm still a Trump supporter before the trade so-called issue. Okay, now in year 2000, US GDP may be close to 40% of the world and a key trade partner of many countries. But in year 2004 now, US is only the number one trade partner of less than 10 countries. On the other hand, China is the number one trade partner of 138 countries. So my question is, what gives Trump the confidence that he can control the world trading? Because it's a world, US GDP is less than 20% now of the whole world, and it's less than 10% of the number one trade partner of 10 countries. Also 10 countries, okay? Thank you.
I think if there's one thing that there would be consensus with the panelists and everyone in the room is nobody needs to give Trump confidence.
But that's now dodging. That's a very cheap way to weasel your way out of the question. So, what do you think? How can you steer?
This is what I think is the thinking of Trump and others that would be supportive of his aggressive actions. That certainly these actions would have been better taken 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 16 years ago, ideally before we decided to grant China most favored nations trade status. And in Trump's defense, these were points that he was making well before he ever pursued elective office. So I think what he would probably say, sure, the timing would have been better if someone like me would have done this 16 years ago, but if not now, when? Because our ability to impact change for the reasons that you shared, the fact that we now are just the top trading partner of 10 countries versus where China's at, that our strength and power and influence to make dramatic altercation to these policies is not going to be stronger 4 years from today if we wait.
I'll just break my word and have another last question, but that's really the last one. Up here?
Just a quick question, which is a follow-up question to the panel. Do you feel that Trump's actions, because Trump is the number one, and I think you all agreed on that, the most powerful person, in a way, these actions are going to give away the leadership to the number two in a shorter span of time than otherwise may have happened? That's the question.
Please let us know who you are.
I'm Rajiv Kaul from Nico, Calcutta.
Thank you.
I mean, time is limited, so I'm not going to expand on this as much as I want, but I do worry. I mean, Trump uses the rhetoric of making America great or putting America first, and America has had the amazing, privileged position of being the world leader across so many domains in the post-war era. And it has been an amazing privilege. It has benefited the United States in many ways because it's been able to shape the world to its, to his benefit. And so I would say selfishly as an American, there's no internal reason, there's no reason that America has to be the leader of the world. That's not something that was set out by God or something. But from a selfish position as an American, that's something that I've lived comfortably with. And I think when people use this rhetoric as putting America first, and we see actions from the president that seems to be taken away, and I think people across the globe recognize this, that seems to be America abdicating that position, then that is something that concerns me, that we're going to see a world order one day where the United States is not the leader of it.
Shifting powers, as says the motto of St.Gallen Symposium. To conclude this very fertile round of arguments, let's look a bit ahead in time. And Jason, you are no longer working for the Republican Party directly as Chief of Staff of a senator, but you're offering now strategic advice for those who want to get elected, for instance. What do the Republicans have to do to defend their Congress majority in the midterm elections that are just around the corner?
We need to deliver for the working class voter. And if you look at the priorities of the president as it relates to the debate around continuing the tax cuts that he put in place last time, what he really wants to do is extend them in a way that makes an even more dramatic benefit for working class voters. Anyone in negotiations with the president and in the Oval Office about what tax policy is going to look like in the United States, his priorities are very straightforward. He does not want to tax overtime pay. Salaried workers do not get overtime pay. Overtime pay is something that's very much impacts struggling working class voters. He doesn't want to tax tips, and he doesn't want to tax Social Security for people on pensions, for the elderly. So his focus of his policies is to make sure that he delivers as much benefit to the average and frankly below average wage earner in America. And that is going to be very determinative in our ability to be successful because that is the emerging coalition of the Republican Party. and less of a priority in there, for good or bad, right, are things like corporate tax cuts and carried interest for hedge funds and other things, which I could make and honestly would make an argument does benefit greatly working class voters. But far and away, the priority of the president recognizing he's going into the midterms is to deliver real benefit of higher standard of living for median wage earners in America.
Ryan, if we want to see the opposite happening next November, what does it take for a blue wave?
I think that right now the world could stop and there would be a blue wave in the sense that all signs are pointing that direction. I don't envy Jason for his job, trying to put Republicans in Congress in 2026, because when we started this panel, I was speaking about sort of things that happen predictably. And one thing that we know that happens predictably is the president's party loses seats in Congress in the midterm. But they especially lose seats when they have a very unpopular president. And unless something changes dramatically, and maybe it could be policy that Jason's talking about, I doubt that for a lot of reasons. But unless something changes dramatically, Donald Trump is going to remain unpopular and perhaps become more unpopular. And that means that Democrats will probably have great gains in the election. We spent a lot of time talking about how this is sort of an extraordinary moment and arguing about how extraordinary it was. But I think that one thing is pretty clear is some of these sort of rules of politics that we've seen in the past apply here, and we'll probably see them apply in 2026 as well.
Marcela, whether there's a blue wave, red wave, whatever the case may be, what gives you hope to continue with the work you're doing? Because migration reform, we've heard it, is a very tough cookie to bite on. So what gives you hope no matter the political circumstances?
Look, I do think that and trust that the world moves, the arc of history moves towards justice. I think we do have strong institutions that I really hope will continue to hold and keep us in line. I think this is a wake-up call for all of us to have a government that is more immediately responsive to these really big issues, and that we are more honest with the American public around the trade-offs of policies. And lastly, I think I hope, and with your help, that we can really work on the issue of misinformation, because otherwise it doesn't matter what we do. We're not having this conversation, and I think the more that we talk to each other, the more we're going to realize we're less far apart. But for that, we need to understand the root causes and work together toward making technology work for all of us.
And you actually can already act on what Marcela is advising you, that we need to talk more to each other. And before we thank our panel, you will have a wonderful opportunity to talk a lot to people that you don't know, because in an instant you can start queuing up for lunch, which will be served in the main building. So don't get grumpy if you have to queue up. This is your chance to make new friends, have engaging conversations with people that might disagree fundamentally with you on a lot of things, and then continue over a delicious meal that our volunteer staff is serving you. We'll continue with our programming at 2 o'clock. Please check on my symposium app where you're headed to. And now please thank our wonderful panelists for a great debate.